something interesting taking place that I think as Christians maybe we either are aware of or we certainly feel the results of. And broadly speaking, we live in a historical context. And I grew up a Canadian. I guess I'm Generation X. That would be the category I fall into. I grew up in a Christian home in London, Ontario, a fairly conservative town. I went to public elementary and high school. I went to a public university. And so, I kind of grew up learning from, I guess, reflecting the culture. Certainly, I grew up in a Christian home, but more and more as I look back on my own upbringing as a part of the culture, I'm seeing more and more how the culture shaped the way that I thought, much more than I expected it would. But we live in a historical context, and in Canada, for those of us maybe in the older generations, we remember a day where Canadian culture and Christian culture, there was a great deal of overlap. I don't think I would ever say Canada was a Christian nation, but certainly the way that our country fought, the way our laws were formed, the way, generally speaking, the way our culture looked at the world was Christian in its outlook. That didn't mean everyone was a Christian, but by and large, people thought Christianly about the world. They would have subscribed to things like, the Ten Commandments as a moral set of laws for everybody, that the Bible was a divinely inspired book, that there's a creator God out there somewhere, even if we don't happen to know who he is, and those kinds of things. Well, what's happened in a fairly short period of time is we've gone from a place where the church, the Christian church, has very much shared a lot of overlap with the culture in terms of worldview, to the place where really that overlap is drastically shrunk, if not completely been eliminated altogether. And so more and more, there's very little we share in terms of the way that we look at the world as opposed to the way the culture looks at the world. And this is especially true, I think, in the area of our view of humanity and the way that we think about the nature of humanity and what we are and what our purpose is and all of those things. And so that's an interesting perspective that I see now. When I'm thinking about the subject of gender in particular, I see a change has taken place in a very short period of time. My concern, again, because so many of the next generation of Christians are growing up in the culture and being educated. Some of us are educating our kids at home. Some educate them in Christian schools, but a good majority of Christian young people are, like my kids, they go to a public school. And the things that they're being taught, they absorb, and kids naturally will. The one in particular is in this whole subject discussion about gender and understanding gender. I know in conversations with my own children that the culture is really shaping the way they think about this subject. I took this from the 2015 revised health curriculum that came out, that there was quite a stir about when it was re-released. But even the glossary of terms in the curriculum really, I think really portrays where our culture has landed in terms of the way we think about gender. In the glossary, it defines the word sex as the category of male or female based on characteristics that are biologically determined. So by and large, there's still this consensus that a person's sex is their biology, their anatomy. Someone is born male or female, whereas gender is a term that refers to those characteristics of women and men that are socially constructed. All right, so this is the way that society thinks about being male or female, or how the individual thinks about being male or female, and we understand that gender then really is a sociological category. It governs the way that we interact and identify with one another as either male or female, which I think is very interesting. In other words, if we want it to be just a little more specific about it, sex basically refers to our bodies, our anatomy, whereas gender refers to, again, those kind of stereotypical ways that we conceive of ourselves as male or female. I tried to pick the most stereotypical male and female clip art that I could find. How did I do? Did I hit the nail on the head? Pretty good. Okay. All right. Don't be upset with me. That was for a purpose, just to illustrate how culturally we tend to differentiate in terms of social categories of male and female. I'm not saying this is the way it ought to be. Just stereotypically, that's often the way it is. What I'm interested to know is how we got to where we are. And I'm interested to know that, but I'm also interested as Christians for us to understand that, because sometimes, again, the culture has a way of shaping the way we think, our assumptions, so that we simply receive the cultural dogma, if you will, as if it's just matter of fact. Well, how do we know this is the case? How do we know gender is the social construct, versus sex, which is the anatomical? And we just assume everybody just knows that. And if you're old enough, well, no, that's not the case. But for the next generation, that's just the way we've grown up, understanding. But I like seeing how the ideas we have today have a history, and seeing that where we are today is not the result of just the self-evident truths of the universe becoming apparent, but rather it's the result of a culmination of thinking and a change in thinking over time. It's interesting in the culture, the caricature of the culture. Historically, society was patriarchal, right? Male-dominated, and for all the negatives that had, what often frustrates me is usually that the negative patriarchal culture is really labeled, or rather, it's contributed to basically Christianity. That's the church's fault. When it's interesting, historically speaking, if we go back to, again, the Age of Enlightenment and beyond, some of the staunchest patriarchists weren't Christians. In fact, you'll be surprised to know this. You'll see how faces appear again over time if you're here week over week. One of the staunchest defenders of patriarchy was Darwin, interestingly enough. And it wasn't because Darwin held some kind of biblical hierarchy. Rather, he associated that with his theory of evolution. In particular, he writes about this in The Descent of Man, his theory on sexual selection. Here's what Darwin has to say. He says, the chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. How does that hit you? And then he says, thus man has ultimately become superior to women. You see, for Darwin, that was a simple fact of nature. That was a simple fact of evolutionary theory, that because of the natural selection and the whole survival of the fittest and all of the rest, man just through nature attained to a higher or a more superior state of being than did woman. And so Darwin would have, said because of that, that's why, at the time in England, women could not own property. They really didn't have the rights of citizenship. They certainly couldn't vote. They did not have the right to initiate divorce if they were in a marriage that was abusive or whatever. So I find that kind of interesting as a place to start. You don't learn about that in school. It's those narrow-minded and close-headed Christians who were so stuck in their cultural and historical ghetto that they didn't understand. But scientific man knows better. Well, this wasn't the case in Darwin's day. Now, at the same time, however, I don't want to paint a simplistic picture of history. And I mentioned this last week, that history is never encapsulated in the thoughts of one person, nor does the development of thought happen in a straight line. But you can touch down on particularly influential people and see a progression of thought over time. Now, contemporary with Darwin, and this is someone else we met last week, was John Stuart Mill. Mill did not like that perspective. Mills was a liberal thinker. Classical liberalism, which was very much rooted in the rights of the individual. He took great exception to this subjection to an inferior status of women based on some kind of notion of inferiority in being. He said this, all women are brought up, the problem is all women are brought up from the very earliest years in the belief that their ideal of character is the very opposite to that of men. See, in the patriarchy of the day, women were the weaker sex, men the strong, women the weaker, men the intellectual reason, woman, was stereotypically driven by only emotions. So they weren't given the right to higher education because that was just in that day, that was just a waste of time because they weren't designed for that. Well, Mill said, the only reason we think that way is because that women have been taught that way. He said the whole force of education, the whole force of the way we've raised our children is to reinforce this whole notion that the whole force of education, which enslaves women's minds to the idea that they're inferior. And so therefore they aspire to what they're told they are. And so he really wanted to challenge that. The reality is we don't really know what a woman is because we've never freed them to become what they really are. And I think there was certainly culturally some good that was coming out of that. The whole idea of treating women as second-class citizens, he said that has to go. Now, contemporary with Mill as well, actually not contemporary, predating Mill was a woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. who in the 18th century, she was very much vocal and wrote about this whole idea that women were not being given a fair place in society, that there was some kind of cultural bondage that women had been placed in, and that things needed to change. And she wrote a very influential work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Now, at her time, this really didn't create much of a change. But it was absolutely instrumental in what in the later 19th century would become the first wave of really feminist reform. The Suffragette Movement of the late 19th century. How many of you enjoy like Downton Abbey and those kinds of movies and stuff? And you've seen the suffragettes kind of played into the story. They're the ones who are in England, we want the vote. Well, that really is in those programs. That's the tail end of this first wave. And this first wave of feminist thinkers who really picked up on Wollstonecraft's arguments, as well as Mill's, to say, look, women should be treated as equals in terms of our place as citizens in society, and rightly so. So she really inspired this first wave of movement. And the culmination was, sometime in the 20s and 30s, was the legal landscape of the West very much changed. Women received the right to vote. They became seen as full citizens. They were given the right to sue for divorce if they needed to, and they were given the right to own property. And over time, they were given the right to pursue higher education, etc. And so they won many of those rights. And I think in many respects, those were positive moves. So that was the first wave. Now, what is interesting then is following that first wave was a second wave of feminism. And really, the second wave of feminists, it was spearheaded. One of the main features was a woman by the name of Simone de Beauvoir. And while she appreciated what the first wave had accomplished legally, she was still disappointed in the fact that even though women had achieved or attained all of these freedoms and this equality legally, that they were still making, in her opinion, poor choices with them. They were still pursuing things like motherhood and marriage over career and place in the marketplace, or relationships in the marketplace. And so this apparent lack of progress really disturbed them. And so de Beauvoir really felt that real liberation could only come at the level of ideas. What needed to happen was not just the legal progress, but we need to change the way society, but in particular women, think. In terms of the kinds of choices they make, we need to help them think in terms of the kinds of ideas they have. And the first thing that she did was provide intellectual justification for divorcing the whole idea of sex and gender from each other. Here's something she said in her work, The Second Sex, which is, she uses that to refer to females. They're the second sex that was created, is her idea. But she says, look, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is a civilization as a whole that produces this criteria, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine. So what de Beauvoir did was to, in the intellectual mind of the culture, she planted the seed of idea to say, listen, we need to understand that this thing that historically we have called woman is nothing more than an artifact of cultural creation. It's something that we've come up with, and no woman is born a woman. She becomes a woman by being raised in a culture that has created this social artifact. She basically learns to become a woman. Now, there is some truth to that. Women do learn, right, as men do. Men learn how to become men, and women learn how to become women. But it's one thing to say that, and another thing to say that being a woman or a man is entirely a learned process. But she wanted to make that move. She also went on to say that man himself, she's talking about the male now, and she's using this as a contrast to say, look, if good for the man, why not for the woman? She says, man is defined as a being who is not fixed, who makes himself what he is. Remember last week how we started when we talked about the idea of self-creation, how that crept into cultural thought, beginning with Nietzsche, starting with Darwin, and then picking up with Nietzsche. This is where you're going to see these cultural ideas, they don't just go away. What they do is they work themselves into the core of cultural assumptions and thought, and then they get worked out in future theory. And de Beauvoir, she's picking up on this whole idea of self-creation. What man is a self-created being. Man is not a natural species, he's an historical idea, right? Man conceives of himself as what he is from the stories of history and the story he makes for himself. If that's the case for man, why shouldn't it be for woman, was her argument. Well, she was highly influential in influencing. She was French, actually. In fact, one of her partners, she had several life partners, lovers. One of them was Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous philosopher. She was a French woman, but she very much influenced thinking on our continent, in the West. A woman by the name of Betty Friedan, who was a very outspoken, again, feminist thinker in this second wave movement as well. And Friedman picked up on Beauvoir's ideas and really made them more familiar with an American progressive mindset, where she took Beauvoir's ideas away from kind of this existential mindset, and she put it into American speak, ideas that Americans can latch onto much more clearly. She brought it into the realm of individual rights, right? Isn't that something that sounds a little more American, a little more North American? And what she basically argued was that women have been suppressed or oppressed in terms of being allowed to express their individual rights by being captured inside what she called the feminine mystique, which is, again, this cultural narrative of what a woman is and ought to be. And what she then went on to say was, she said, for the first time in history, women are becoming aware of an identity crisis in their own lives. And the crisis she was really thinking of was the crisis of their own self-identity against and in opposition to this imposed or oppressive identity of female, of woman, that culture has foisted on them. She said, a turning point from immaturity that has been called femininity to full human identity. And so what she very much is doing is picking up on this idea of separating gender from sex, very much attaching it to a cultural creation, but now she goes one step further into disassociating gender from identity itself, right? Human identity needs to be separated from this whole cultural construction of male, female, and all that entails. One other woman who followed on her heels, very influential again in the second wave movement, was Kate Millett. And in her work on sexual politics, she really took these ideas then and argued, what needs to happen now in society is that the recognition of this oppression needs to be built into now the education system, even the sciences at every level. Really that all academic and scientific enterprise needs to be devoted to the task of exposing these historical forces of oppression that have captured women in this kind of this cultural caracature. So she says, implicit in all the gender identity development, which takes place through childhood, is the sum total of the parents, the peers, and the culture's notion of what is appropriate to each gender by way of temperament, character, interests, status, worth, gesture, and expression. In other words, all of those things, which would express themselves as male or female characteristics, need to understand that all of them, this gender identity, is really the development. It's the culmination of a developing child's experiences, and that's all it is. It's the way they're enculturated. And so, as she again argued, what we need to do is change the culture. We need to get the culture to reconceive of what it means to be male or female. And by doing that, if we can obliterate those oppressive cultural categories of the past, then we can truly free people, so that they're not raised with any preconceived assumptions of what they're supposed to be. But again, this really opens the way for what is seen as freedom, which is ultimately uninhibited self-creation. Okay. So I just wanted to give you that little historical sketch, which really moves from gender essentialism, where Darwin wants to say gender's built into, that's evolution, that's in the genes, it's inescapable, to this gender as a social construct, and really just to show how in a relatively short period of time, the pendulum has swung from one extreme to the other. And what I want to help us see as Christians is that all of this discussion takes place within a context, and it's the context of a particular worldview. Right? Last week we talked about two ways of viewing the world, right? All is one or all is two. Either it's just the creation, just the universe, or it's the creation and the creator. Okay? So all of their reasoning for good and bad all takes place in a context of a particular view of the world, a view of the world which says that this is all there is. So if we're going to come to a true understanding of human nature itself, the only place, the only capital we have to work with in terms of building that picture, of finding out what really is true, all of that can only be found within the world. And most of that discussion takes place in the realm of human experience. So that's the only thing we can really appeal to come up with the kinds of answers that we need. And of course, as Christians, we don't just realize that we might disagree with people on certain points here and there. Our starting point is completely different. It's completely irreconcilable with the starting point of these kinds of cultural ideas. It's not that we disagree with everything they say, but where we might agree with on some of their points, we agree with them for different reasons. And I think it's important that we understand that, because a lot of times as Christians we can jump into the cultural debates and discussions, and without realizing it, we're using the assumptions of the culture to make our own arguments. And where we might win an argument, if it's not based upon a biblical view of the world, we're ultimately failing Christ, because we're not reflecting his understanding or his revelation of what's true. So that's just a quick sketch that I'm looking at my clock and I'm realizing wasn't that quick, of kind of how our culture has arrived at where it is. And I'm hoping that for some of, in particular, younger people, you see that where the kinds of things our culture applauds, it's not because these things have become self-evident. It's because they've been inherited. These ideas have been delivered over time, and they're ultimately based on a view of the world that excludes God from the equation.